In the wildest corners of North America, hunters face their greatest challenge: survival. From stalking elusive prey to fending off predatory animals, these real-life encounters will test their courage and instincts. In this video, we dive into heart-pounding stories of hunters forced to battle nature head-on, where the hunt turns into a fight for life. Will they escape the wilderness unscathed, or become part of its unforgiving history? The forest of British Columbia was quiet as Henry Brooks trudged through the dense undergrowth. Cool with the bite of fall, the air clung to his clothes and settled heavily around his shoulders. At 58, Henry had seen it all, or so he thought. His rifle, a well-maintained .300 Winchester Magnum, sat snugly in his hands as he pushed through the brush, his boots crunching the dry leaves beneath him. The world around him was a painter's palette of deep greens, browns, and hints of gold as the trees slowly shed their leaves. The hunt was on. Henry had chosen this patch of forest because it held abundant moose and because he knew it like the back of his hand. He knew where the moose bedded, where they drank, and where they grazed. He was confident in his skills. But there was a warning in the air, something just out of place that he couldn't quite place. The moose he had been tracking had passed through a clearing hours earlier, its massive hooves leaving deep prints in the damp soil. Henry carefully followed the tracks, his sharp eyes scanning the area around him. His mind was trained to look for movement and focused entirely on the task. He was aware of the forest's rhythms, the flutter of birds taking off, the rustling of smaller animals in the underbrush. But something in the silence felt wrong. It wasn't until he reached the edge of a thick patch of spruce that he heard a branch snapping, the sound unmistakable. It was loud and close. Henry's heart skipped a beat. A sudden instinct told him to stop, to hold his breath. The hairs on the back of his neck stood at attention. His hand instinctively gripped the rifle tightly. His eyes darted toward the noise, scanning the brush, expecting the moose to break through at any moment. But it wasn't a moose that emerged from the shadows. It was a grizzly bear. The animal moved slowly at first, watching Henry closely. The bear was easily over 800 pounds, all ready for hibernation. Henry froze. The moment stretched, but his eyes never left the animal. He had hunted black bears before, had even encountered a grizzly from a safe distance. But this was different. Henry's heart pounded in his chest as his mind raced. The rifle. He had it, but he wasn't sure about the angle. His instincts told him to retreat, to get a better shot. But the bear was already circling, its low growl vibrating through the air. The hunter's breath came faster now, his pulse quickening as the bear advanced. The rifle in his hands felt heavier. The bear's massive form loomed closer, its eyes narrowing with every step. Henry's finger hovered over the trigger. He wasn't ready yet. He had to wait for the perfect shot. But the bear wasn't waiting. With a sudden, explosive roar, the grizzly lunged. The sound of its charge was deafening, the ground shaking beneath its boots as the beast closed the distance instantly. The rifle was no use now. Henry fired, but the shot went wild, missing the bear entirely as it bore down on him, its claws outstretched, massive jaws open wide. He had no time to aim. The bear hit him, knocking the air from his lungs and sending him crashing to the forest floor. For a moment, the world spun. Henry could hear nothing but the pounding of his heart and the roaring sound of blood rushing in his ears. He gasped for air, but it was hard to breathe. The bear was on top of him now, its breath hot and heavy as it sniffed him. Henry's hand scrambled for his rifle, but the bear was too close, its clawed paws swiping at him. His fingers brushed the barrel of his rifle, but it was too late. The bear's claws raked across his chest. Pain flared in every direction. Henry gritted his teeth against the agony and tried to push the bear off, but it was like trying to move a boulder. The bear's weight pressed down on him, its claws digging deeper with every movement. With every ounce of strength he could muster, Henry twisted his body, using his free hand to grab at his belt. He felt the edge of his hunting knife and pulled it out, hoping against hope that he could get in close enough to drive it into the bear. But the grizzly's massive paw landed a blow across his face, sending him reeling. The pain was unbearable. Henry's vision blurred, and he fought to stay conscious. His rifle, his only hope, was out of reach. The bear's jaws snapped dangerously close to his face, and for the first time in his life, Henry felt fear. Raw, gut-wrenching fear. This wasn't a game. This was survival. In a desperate move, Henry twisted his body, kicking out with his legs. His boot connected with the bear's underbelly, and for a brief second, the grizzly reeled back, giving him just enough space to pull himself up. Blood poured from his wounds, but he didn't have time to think about that. He had to move. Henry stumbled to his feet, his legs shaking as he fought against the blackness, closing in at the edges of his vision. The bear was still there, and Henry knew he had only one shot left. He stumbled toward his rifle, his breath ragged in his throat, his body screaming for him to stop. But he couldn't. Not now. The gun was within reach. He grabbed it and with trembling hands raised it to his shoulder. The bear was charging again, its eyes filled with rage. With everything he had left, Henry fired. The shot rang out, and this time it found its mark. The bear reared back, its massive body shuddering as it released a final roar of fury. The bullet's force had done its job, and the bear dropped, crashing to the ground with a tremendous thud. Henry collapsed to his knees, his body broken and battered. Blood soaked his clothes and his chest burned with every breath. But he had survived. He had done what he needed to do. He reached for his radio, his fingers fumbling as he pressed the button. His voice, ragged and weak, called for help, and he knew they would come. It was over. The sun had just begun to dip behind the jagged peaks of Montana's Paradise Valley when Jonah Weaver, a hunter in his late 40s, found himself deep in the woods, surrounded by nothing but pines and vegetation. Jonah felt that something was off that day. The quiet, the way the wind had suddenly stopped, was unsettling. It was a kind of silence that spoke louder than any noise. The air felt thick, as if even the forest had grown wary. Jonah had set out that morning before dawn, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his backpack packed with supplies. Today he was after a bull elk he had been tracking for the past week. The elk's massive tracks led him farther than expected, deeper into the valley's heart, a place even Jonah had never ventured. It was the smell that first made Jonah stop. It wasn't the earthy scent of pine needles or the musky odor of damp soil. It was something more distinct, a human-made smell. He paused, his hand instinctively tightening around the grip of his rifle. There, through the trees, about 100 yards ahead, something caught his eye. A small camp scattered with belongings, a tarp, a few chairs, some cooking utensils. At first, Jonah thought he had found the remnants of a hunter's campsite, but as he moved closer, he noticed the small things that didn't add up. The fire pit was cold, untouched for days at least, and the gear was haphazardly thrown about as if someone had left in a hurry. His breath caught in his throat as a tingle ran up his spine. It wasn't the kind of disarray left by someone packing up for a long day in the field. This looked like the aftermath of something. Jonah crouched down, inspecting the scattered equipment. A half-burnt jacket lay by the fire pit. The fabric singed, but no sign of blood or damage would explain its state. A small hunting knife, the kind he carried, lay under a broken chair. His fingers lingered over it momentarily, feeling the cold steel trying to make sense of the situation. The unease began to creep deeper into his gut. His senses were on high alert now, and he stood turning in a slow circle, scanning the tree line. Something felt wrong. Jonah could feel eyes on him even though there was no sign of anyone. His skin prickled as he started to back away, his mind running through the possibilities. Whoever had left this camp wasn't far. The fire pit was too recent. A snap of a twig from behind him made Jonah whirl, his rifle coming up in a smooth, practiced motion. There was nothing, just the shadowed trees stretching high above him, the wind still holding its breath. He lowered his rifle, his pulse quickening, but before he could take another step, he heard it again. A faint rustling in the underbrush, closer this time. Jonah froze, the hairs on the back of his neck standing tall. A chill ran down his spine, though it wasn't the cold. It was pure fear. His instincts kicked in, honed by years of experience. He turned toward a ridge, hoping to get a better vantage point. But as he ascended the rocky slope, he could feel it again, the sensation that something was following him. It wasn't a deer's normal rustle or a squirrel's scurrying. Jonah's breath caught as he pressed himself against the rough stone, his rifle now aimed toward the tree line below. The noise continued, faint but unmistakable. Jonah's mind raced through the possibilities. Was it another hunter? Had someone else gotten too close to his territory? The thought unsettled him. But he wasn't alone in these woods. Plenty of human and animal predators made their home here. Still, the way the movement was timed, always just behind him, made his stomach twist in a way he couldn't ignore. Jonah glanced over his shoulder once more. Nothing, yet the feeling of being watched and stalked grew stronger and more intense. Then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and not far behind. Jonah's pulse skyrocketed. He swung his rifle around, scanning the area with growing desperation. His breath came in sharp bursts as the sounds grew closer. Whoever or whatever was following him wasn't trying to hide anymore. It was almost as if it wanted him to know. The trees parted ahead of him, and Jonah's eyes locked on the figure standing in the shadows. He thought his mind was playing tricks on him for a moment, but no, the figure was too tall, too wide to be human. Jonah's heart thudded painfully as he realized what stood before him. He couldn't see the animal clearly in the faint light, only its silhouette, but the shape was unmistakable. A predator with powerful muscles and a menacing form. The wind shifted and Jonah could smell the musk of its fur, sharp and pungent. His breath caught in his throat. He was being stalked by what seemed to be a bear. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his body refused to move. Every fiber of his being screamed to escape, but his legs felt as if they were cemented to the earth. Jonah's grip tightened on the rifle, his eyes trained on the dark form. The animal stepped forward, its heavy paws sinking into the soft earth, but still Jonah couldn't move. He wasn't sure what had caused the rustling earlier or why it had been so intent on following him. But in that moment, he knew. He was not alone, and he wasn't just being watched. He was being hunted. The forest was silent again, except for the low, rumbling growl that emanated from the figure. It wasn't far from Jonah, and he could feel the ground tremble under its weight. The creature's gaze never wavered. It was watching him, waiting for him to make a move. Time stretched thin, and Jonah's mind raced. His heart pounded in his chest as every instinct told him to run, but he knew that any sudden movement might trigger an attack. The wind was still, the silence unbearable, until the figure moved again, slowly, deliberately. Jonah's breath came in sharp bursts and he stepped back. He didn't know what the animal was, maybe a grizzly, perhaps something else, but he didn't wait to find out. Jonah turned, his legs finally obeying, and ran. His heart thundered in his chest as he sprinted through the woods, the sound of heavy footsteps pursuing him from behind. But he dared not look back. The forest seemed to close in on him as he raced toward the ridge, where he knew the valley would open up. Jonah's legs burned, his chest aching with every breath, but he kept running, driven by the fear that something was behind him, closing the distance. And when he finally broke into the open, he didn't stop. He ran until he reached his truck, the safety of civilization, just a few steps away. The woods were no longer silent. The forest seemed alive with noise, but Jonah didn't look back. He slammed the door shut, locked it, and didn't exhale until the engine roared to life. Jonah had survived. He didn't know what had been watching him or following him, but he was alive, and that was enough for today. 63-year-old Tom Hadley had spent more than 20 years hunting in the Pine Barrens, a maze of dense forest in New Jersey that most people wouldn't dare venture into without a guide. He was no novice, not by any means. The day had started with a slight misstep. A detour off his usual trail, just a few yards off the beaten path, had initially seemed harmless. The sun was still high, and he had enough light to see where he was going. But as he moved deeper into the forest, the trees began to crowd in, and the undergrowth thickened. The familiar landmarks he relied on slowly faded into the distance. After a few hours of tracking, Tom realized he hadn't seen any signs of deer. His sense of direction began to fail him. He turned around trying to retrace his steps, but the landscape was unrecognizable. Tom's growing sense of unease gnawed at him. His mind raced with calculations, every scenario flashing through his head. He'd be fine if he could find his bearings and get back on track. But the more he tried to force his way through the tangled woods, the more disoriented he became. His map was useless in the thickening foliage. Once familiar, the sounds of the forest around him now seemed to be a strange soundtrack to his growing panic. His knife was secure on his belt, his scoped rifle still slung over his shoulder, and his survival gear was intact. He had the basics, enough to last a night if it came to that. But that was a far cry from what he was used to. He was a hunter, not a survivalist. His instincts told him to focus, to keep his head, but the sinking feeling in his chest wouldn't let up. The sun was now setting, the light quickly draining from the sky, and with it, his chances of finding his way out before darkness set in. Tom knew the Pine Barrens weren't forgiving. The temperature would drop quickly once the sun disappeared, and he couldn't afford to be out here after dark. He needed to find shelter, or at least a way to orient himself. But the woods made even the most experienced feel small, and the longer he wandered, the more he realized how truly lost he was. His mind kept cycling back to the rustling he'd been hearing. At first, he had dismissed it as a squirrel or a bird, but the noise had been consistent. It went in rhythmic patterns like something was tracking him, moving through the brush just out of sight. He stopped and turned, rifle held tightly in his hands now. He could feel his pulse in his throat, the sweat starting to bead on his forehead despite the cool evening air. His instincts screamed at him to get moving, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. He scanned the shadows in the underbrush, trying to make out shapes, but all he saw were dark, indistinct forms in the gathering dusk. Another rustle, closer this time, and then the unmistakable glint of eyes in the shadows. Tom's breath caught in his throat as he focused on the figure. It was small, cat-like in shape, with a pair of eyes that gleamed with the reflection of his scope. A bobcat, he could tell by the size, the shape of its ears, and the way it moved. Quick, graceful, and predatory. The creature was no larger than a house cat, but far more dangerous, especially when cornered. The bobcat crouched low, its body poised and ready to spring, its eyes locked on Tom, sizing him up. His heart raced, the reality of the situation sinking in. The animal had been watching him for who knew how long. Now, it was too close. Tom knew better than to think of the bobcat as harmless. It wasn't scared of him. It had no reason to be. In the wild, a bobcat would stalk a hunter just as easily as a rabbit if it felt cornered. The bobcat's first growl sent a chill down Tom's spine. The animal wasn't backing off. It was getting bolder. He tried to steady himself, raising the rifle slightly, but the bobcat was already moving. It darted forward in a blur, its claws flashing in the dim light as it lunged at his leg. Tom barely had time to react, swiping his rifle in front of him in a desperate attempt to ward it off. The impact sent the rifle spinning from his grip, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. The bobcat was fast. Its claws raked down his shin, leaving deep, burning gashes that nearly brought him to his knees. He grunted in pain, swinging his fist down toward the cat, landing a blow to its back. But it was already gone, leaping back into the undergrowth with frightening speed, leaving Tom breathless and on the ground. His heart was hammering in his chest as he scrambled to his feet. His leg burned with pain, but he couldn't afford to think about it. The bobcat had made its intentions clear. Tom retrieved his knife from his belt, hands trembling. The world around him felt smaller now, suffocating in its weight. The rustling was back, but now it was different. It wasn't the cat. Something else was moving, circling him in the growing darkness. He could hear the branches snap underfoot, the crunch of dry leaves, and the faintest huffing sound that sent his mind spiraling into panic. The forest seemed to close in on him, and the night was nearly upon him. Tom's panic heightened as he realized he had to survive. The bobcat wasn't his only threat now. Something else, something much bigger, was out there, stalking him. Every shadow, every snap of a twig, every gust of wind seemed to mock him. He had no idea how long he had been lost. Hours, days, time didn't matter anymore. It was all about surviving the night. And with that thought, Tom turned, his knife held tightly in his hand, and began to move. He couldn't afford to stay still. The woods were no longer a place of comfort. They were a jungle, and in the pine barrens the hunter could easily become the hunted. The only thing that mattered now was finding safety, and fast. Then, through the haze of panic and pain, something caught his eye. A faint light in the distance, flickering like a distant star. It was small but unmistakable. A campfire. Tom's heart raced with renewed hope. He had no idea how far he had wandered, but the glow of the fire meant civilization was within reach. With all his strength, he forced his legs to carry him toward the light, ignoring the burning pain in his shin. The light grew brighter as he approached, and soon he could make out the shape of a small campsite. Tom was saved. As Steve edged through the dense underbrush, the wind cut through the trees with a biting chill. Steve had spent many autumns stalking elk in the rugged hills of Colorado. This year, however, something gnawed at him. Maybe it was the weather, the late November cold that had set in, or perhaps the silence in the woods, but Steve couldn't shake that strange feeling. His boots crunched softly on the frost-covered ground as he moved carefully. He had been tracking the bull elk for hours, and now, at last, he had found it. The massive bull stood in a small clearing ahead, its coat thick for the winter, and its antlers impressive, wide and dark, framed by the trees, the perfect shot. Steve slowly knelt, adjusting his scope, his fingers tightening on the trigger. With the first breath of winter air, Steve squeezed the trigger, sending the bullet toward the massive creature. The shot rang out. For a moment, Steve watched the elk, anticipating it to drop, but instead, the bull's head jerked, its body shuddering as it staggered forward, grunting. Something was wrong. The shot had struck. It should have been down by now. But the elk wasn't down. It was angry. It snorted and turned, its eyes wide and wild. The animal's instincts had kicked in and wouldn't fall without a fight. The elk charged, the thunderous sound of hooves pounding the earth, shaking the ground beneath him. The hunter scrambled backward, his heart racing. Steve's mind raced as he frantically moved to the side, his foot catching on a root. He stumbled but managed to stay on his feet, feeling the earth tremble beneath him. The elk wasn't giving up. Steve's rifle, now discarded behind him, felt like a distant memory. It didn't matter. The elk was already on him. His survival now depended on something else, his wits and his knowledge of the land. He sprinted, eyes darting, searching for anything to shelter him. The trees ahead were thick, but there was a small ravine cutting through the forest like a scar in the earth. He might have a chance if he could make it to the ravine. His legs burned as he ran toward the ravine, pushing past branches and shrubs, the sound of the elk's hooves growing louder. The creature was closing in, its body a blur of muscle and fury. He had been in close calls before, but this was different. He had no weapon, no way to defend himself against a massive creature like this. He reached the ravine just as the elk's hooves thundered behind him. He jumped, landing on the slope, and immediately felt the loose gravel shift beneath him. The terrain was treacherous, sharp rocks, slippery dirt, but it was his only option. The elk slowed just enough to adjust its path, its eyes locked onto Steve as it lowered its head and charged. The sound of the hooves reverberated in Steve's chest, but there was no time to waste. He scrambled down the slope, his boots slipping against the uneven ground. The ravine provided some cover, but it wasn't much. Steve's chest tightened, panic creeping in as he realized the elk wasn't giving up. It would follow him into the ravine if it had to. The ravine's edge curved sharply ahead, but there was no way to escape in that direction. His only hope was to move back toward the trees, out of the path of the elk. But as he began to return, the elk was already there. The bull had anticipated his movement, its senses keen and sharp. The hunter was trapped. Steve's pulse quickened, his mind racing. The elk was close now, the pounding of its hooves deafening as it thundered toward him. The animal's eyes were wild with pain, its breath labored. It was injured, which made it dangerous. Steve knew this was a fight for his life. He had to think fast. He glanced around the ravine, scanning for any tools or terrain that could help. To his left, a small patch of trees stood clustered together, their trunks thick and sturdy. He could use them as a shield if he could make it to the trees. He took a deep breath and moved quickly, the ground unstable beneath him as he fought to keep his footing. The elk charged again, its massive body crashing through the brush. Steve pushed forward, his muscles screaming in protest. The bull was gaining on him, but he was close to the needed cover. He darted behind a cluster of trees, his back pressing against the rough bark. The elk stopped, its hooves scraping against the ground as it huffed in frustration, circling the area. The elk let out a frustrated bellow, its hooves scraping against the rocks. But it didn't charge again. Slowly, carefully, it retreated into the forest, its wounded body unable to sustain the chase any longer. Steve remained motionless, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins as the sound of the elk faded. His body ached, his mind exhausted from the intensity of the encounter. But he had survived. With the elk gone, Steve made his way out of the ravine and back toward his camp, every step heavy with relief and exhaustion. The hunt had ended, not in the way he had imagined, but with a lesson learned in survival and respect for the wild creatures that called this land home. The cold air of early October clung to Doug's skin as he went through the dense underbrush of the Adirondacks. It was still dark, the first light of dawn barely a promise on the horizon. At 31 years old, Doug wasn't an experienced hunter. He was smart, and for the last 2 years, he had been perfecting his methods of baiting and waiting, relying on his instincts as much as intelligence. He had set up his bait site the evening before, where he had often caught sight of the bears during their morning rounds. He had a good mix of scents, a blend of sweet and savory that always attracted the bears. But Doug's eyes narrowed when he approached the clearing that early morning. The bait was torn apart, and the remnants of broken branches and disturbed ground showed signs of a recent raid. The damage wasn't from the usual suspects, small, curious bears just getting into his stash. It looked like something huge had caused it. Doug crouched low, examining the tracks left behind in the dirt. They were fresh, and the size of the prints confirmed his suspicion. A large male, likely well over 300 pounds, had been through. His pulse quickened. He had a moment to make a decision. Should he move on and find a new site, or should he stay and try to work the situation in his favor? Doug knew that sometimes the most dangerous moments were when a hunter let their guard down. His instincts told him to stick with it. He would set up a new bait, take a different approach, and wait from the tree stand he'd set up nearby. He wasn't going to let this bear get the better of him. The minutes stretched as Doug carefully climbed the tree stand. The heavy rifle in his hands felt familiar and comforting. He checked his gear, ensuring the safety was off and his scope aligned with the dark woods ahead. His breath came out in soft puffs as he settled into position. The forest was quiet. He remained still, eyes scanning the woods below, waiting for his moment. The bait was set, a pile of sweet-smelling fruit, peanut butter, and scattered corn just a few yards from his stand. Doug felt the tension in his chest. He had no idea how long he would be waiting. It could take hours, but that was part of hunting. Patience was everything. His mind wandered as he waited, but he didn't let himself relax. His senses were sharp, attuned to the slightest sounds. The minutes ticked by, each one adding to the silence around him. Then there was a movement just as the sky began to lighten. Something shifted below. Doug's heart skipped a beat, but forced himself to stay calm. The large bear appeared, stepping out of the shadows at the edge of the clearing. It had broad shoulders, thick fur, and a deep, intimidating presence. The bear sniffed the air. Doug's breath caught in his throat as he watched the creature move toward the bait. It found what it sought, and its approach was without hesitation. Doug's grip tightened on his rifle as he tracked the bear's every move. The bear reached the bait and began to feed, its body blocking most of the view. Doug's finger hovered over the trigger, but didn't take the shot. He knew this was a delicate situation, but he wanted to watch the magnificent animal some more. The bear, fully engrossed in the food, didn't notice him yet. Doug's heartbeat echoed in his ears as he slowly exhaled, trying to steady his nerves. The minutes felt like hours, but he held firm, admiring the creature. Suddenly, the bear's head jerked up. Its dark eyes scanned the area, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air. Doug froze, not daring to make a sound. The bear's gaze seemed to settle on the tree stand, and time seemed to stop momentarily. Doug's mind raced. Had the bear caught his scent? He cursed himself for not being more careful. He had always known that a bear's senses were sharper than any hunter's, but this one seemed particularly alert. Then, with surprising agility, the bear took a few steps forward. The hair on the back of Doug's neck stood up. He had made a critical mistake and underestimated the bear's intelligence and boldness. The animal was coming closer, possibly sensing the hunter's presence. Doug's mind worked quickly. His rifle was at the ready, but suddenly he feared he wouldn't be able to make a clear shot, and hurting the bear without killing it would only make it more aggressive. He needed to stay calm. The bear was only a few feet away now, its breath deep and heavy, a low growl emanating from its throat. Doug's chest tightened, but he panicked. Doug's hand twitched on the rifle, but he couldn't shoot, barely breathing, hoping the bear would turn away. And then, miraculously, the bear did. It hesitated, snorted again, and slowly turned back toward the bait. It seemed satisfied, or at least distracted. Doug's heart was still racing, but he didn't let himself relax. He watched as the bear fed, its massive form filling the clearing. After what felt like an eternity suspended in silence, the bear finally turned and lumbered into the shadows of the trees, vanishing as quietly as it had appeared. Doug remained frozen, gripping the edge of the tree stand with white-knuckled hands, the thunder of his heartbeat roaring in his ears. Minutes passed, slow, cautious, breathless, before he dared to move. He hadn't survived because he was prepared. He hadn't survived because he was brave. He had survived because fate, or maybe mercy, had chosen to let him walk away. The truth settled over him like the cool air. This was not the kind of hunt he had imagined. The biting cold of early December pierced through the dense Wyoming forest, but it was just another part of the hunt for Ryan. Alongside his longtime friends, Tyler and Ben, they had come to track white-tailed deer, a pursuit they had done every season for years. Ryan, a seasoned hunter with a sharp eye and steady hand, had always trusted his instincts. Tyler, a bit younger and more eager, had been hunting with them for only a few years, but had quickly proven himself capable. Ben, the quiet type, handled things with calm precision. Today, they had set out to hunt a large buck they had spotted the day before. By noon, after hours of tracking, something wasn't right. The usual sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, distant bird calls, and wind through the trees, were absent. The silence was suffocating and unsettling. The only sound was their boots crunching through the snow, adding to the discomfort of being watched. Tyler and Ben noticed the silence, but said nothing. After another hour of tracking, Ryan spotted tracks in the snow not from a deer, but from a pack of wolves. They were fresh and scattered in all directions, indicating movement. Wolves weren't uncommon here, but they typically avoided human contact. These prints, however, suggested something was off. Ryan's unease deepened. Wolves didn't move this close to humans unless desperate or threatened. The pack seemed to be circling, moving in the same direction they were. As they cautiously retraced their steps, the quiet was unbearable, every snap of a twig amplified. Then Ryan heard a soft rustling followed by a pair of glowing yellow eyes between the trees. A wolf, closer than it should be. Another rustle came from the other side, followed by a growl. Suddenly, wolves darted from the trees, moving with terrifying speed and precision. The first wolf lunged at Ben, its jaws snapping inches from his throat. The pack continued charging. Ryan fired twice, hitting one of the wolves in the chest, but it didn't stop. The pack was relentless. Tyler's shot went wide, and he stumbled back, realizing they were outmatched. Ben went down first, a wolf latching onto his leg and dragging him to the ground. Despite fighting back, Ben was quickly overwhelmed and torn apart. Filled with panic, Ryan grabbed Tyler and pushed him toward the ravine. They ran, the wolves hot on their heels. They reached the ravine just as the wolves lunged again. Tyler climbed up the rocky incline and the wolves hesitated at the bottom, growling. Ryan knew they were safe for the moment, but not out of danger. The wolves circled, waiting. Ryan's fingers trembled as he pressed the button on the radio, his voice barely steady enough to call for help. The cold bite at his skin was nothing compared to the fear gripping his chest. He and Tyler huddled in silence, the dark woods alive with tension, every distant crack of a branch sounding like a warning. All they could do now was wait and hope. Hours dragged by, each minute stretching unbearably long. The forest remained still except for the low, restless growls that occasionally echoed beyond the tree line. Then, at last, a voice cut through the static, their names shouted from the distance. Searchers. Help had come. The wolves slipped into the shadows as if they understood the fight was over. Relief flooded Ryan, but it was heavy. Too heavy. Ben wasn't with them. He never would be again. As the rescue team pulled them from the clearing and the sound of helicopter blades filled the air, Ryan glanced back one last time. The howls of the pack were distant now, swallowed by the forest. They had made it out alive. But survival, he realized, wasn't the same as being okay.